Welcome back, everyone. We are joined today by Ian Proud, a former British diplomat who had several roles at the British Embassy in Moscow between 2014 and 2019. Some of them included the head of the Chancery and also advising UK ministers on economic sanctions. So I really want to speak with you today about this article you wrote recently called "The Coalition of the Willing gets stuck in Groundhog Day," and this is in the context of the Europeans committing themselves to deploying troops in Ukraine and confronting Russia. Also, that the insistence that Russia should not have any veto over such decisions, such as putting troops in Ukraine. And I was wondering what your thoughts were around this and how you link it to Groundhog Day, which is a great movie, by the way.
Yeah, great movie indeed. So essentially, the idea came from the fact that every day people like von der Leyen and Mark Rutte, wake up and they go through exactly the same motions again and do exactly the same things as they've done on the previous day. With regard to Russia, the clock resets at 6 a.m. sort of every day. Well, the difference actually, that great 1993 movie, kind of Groundhog Day, the point of the movie really, was the fact that, every day that the main protagonist, he realized if he wanted to get what he needed in life, he had to adapt and change his approach. So he's trying to kind of court Andy McDowell, the female love interest, in the movie. And every day the clock resets and he's learned something from the previous kind of loop of 24 hours and he does something a bit different every day until eventually he wins her love, and for some reason they break the cycle so they can carry on into a kind of a normal time frame after that. The difference with the European Union is that they wake up every day at 6 a.m., listen to "I've Got You, Babe" by Sonny and Cher, and do exactly the same things as they've done in the previous 24-hour loop, irrespective of the fact that those actions have failed, and take them no closer to what they want. Although, quite frankly, I'm not really clear right now what they want, apart from the kind of defeat of Russia in a war that it's winning.
Yeah, this is something I always notice as well, that you would want to see something, a strategy from the Europeans. Now, strategy isn't just an empty word. It entails setting clear objectives, what you want to achieve, and then also a feasible path towards this. So what resource to have at your disposal to reach these goals. But no one's discussing this. I always hear the same slogans. We have to stand up to Putin, counter reward aggression, unity. It doesn't mean anything. It's just these catchphrases, which sounds wonderful, and everyone have to adopt to them, and it locks everyone into doing the same thing over and over again. But one of the things we have to do over and over again, it appears, is to chant that NATO membership is still on the agenda. The path to NATO membership is irreversible, and but this, of course, is something that prevents peace. And same as deploying troops in Ukraine. Once we have a ceasefire, all that ensures is that there can't be a ceasefire, because if Russia went to war to avoid NATO troops in Ukraine, how can that be the peaceful solution after a Russian victory? But what do you make of this, though? Is this just accidental, or they don't want an end to the war?
Well, I think through their actions, it appears that they don't want an end to the war. But one of the reasons, I think, for their actions, and I've said this kind of before a few times, is that it's that, trying to win a war by committee. You can't, in that sort of 27 nation group of the EU or the 32 nation group of NATO, you can never agree on decisive action because of the needs of collective, decision making. So they can never really decide to do sort of anything, with any authority, apart from to kind of maintain the status quo. Intergovernmental groups are great at maintaining the status quo. And Donald Trump has come along and he's had a good go at, securing some sort of peace framework, for Ukraine, which is a massive change in the status quo that would decisively take NATO off of the table, for example. But the kind of the EU club in Europe is resistant to that because it's changed and they can't agree amongst themselves to make that change. So what that appears like, for the outside observer is that they want the war to continue. And of course that is a natural outcome of their Groundhog Day actions that they, in their little committee, they can't decide anything. So committees, bureaucracies, I mean, I see the European Union essentially as a big undemocratic bureaucracy. That they want to carry on doing what they did the day before, which is inevitably is what they do. So I mean, I think that's the condition. And of course, it's held up by some extremely hardline views, within certain members, within certain key positions within the European institutions themselves. Von der Leyen is one, Kai Kallas is another. One, I'm not really sure who's more powerful or more stupid, but I mean, that is how I kind of assess the situation today. And of course, Britain has kind of lost in space, really not, clear on what it wants to do. We've got Donald Trump visiting the UK now. We're just in a very confused and complex place. And what that means is that thousands of Ukrainian and Russian people are dying every day on the battlefield.
Yeah, it's a bit dark, almost a celebratory mood in the media every time they have some reports on death of Russians.
Yeah.
But they used to be the Russians. They always used to criticize the main institution for Russia NATO relations, which was the NATO-Russia Council. And one of the reasons they criticized it was that first all the NATO countries would come together, and because there's so many, they had to work out a common position, and it's a difficult process to be made when you're that many countries. But once
Yeah.
a common position had been reached, and they met with the Russians, there was no point to it because nothing the Russians said or wanted could be implemented, because then they would have to restart the whole process in NATO. So
Exactly.
they because you had this two-tier setup, it meant that there was no flexibility. What it essentially meant was that NATO would make the decision, and the whole role was getting Russia to make unilateral concessions through threats and ultimatums. But is this the problem of the Europeans as well, the EU especially, because
It's
can we only
exactly the
have
same problem.
consensus on confrontation?
Well, I mean, the irony here is that we've been dragged into a confrontation by the Americans, with the help of the Brits. But now confrontation has become the order of the day. We can't break out of it because, we don't have the intellectual and institutional mechanisms, to do that, just because of the very turgid nature of the bureaucracy that the European Union is. So I don't think it's a deliberate. I just think we've been dragged into it by, the Biden administration, before the Obama, administration, and people don't have a way out of that. I think, really that's kind of how I see it. It's not a conscious choice. It's just a cycle. It's just a Groundhog Day cycle that they can't break out of by doing things differently. And, the decision-making process is that collective decision-making is exactly the same in the EU as it is in NATO. Years ago, when I first joined the Foreign Office, I'd go to regular EU meetings. I used to be the head of the Indonesia and the East Timor department at the Foreign Office for a while, and we'd talk about sort of Indonesia and East Timor, and I'd say my bit for the UK, and then the Dutch would get up and they'd say a lot because it used to be their colony, and the Portuguese would get and say a lot because of East Timor. Then every country would say something. We would go through 28 sort of countries, and at the end, nothing was ever decided. And that's just how it works, unfortunately. The difference, if you look at when President Trump invited President Putin to Alaska for their really historic, I think, at the time at least, meeting, this was two leaders of independent states, sovereign states, talking to each other with the power to make decisions. President Trump has the power to make decisions, on behalf of the USA. President Putin has power to make decisions, on the part of the Russian Federation. But that power doesn't exist in Europe, and I think that is the kind of the heavy kind of mud that gets stuck around people's feet. And of course, Volodymyr Zelensky, does theoretically have the power to decide, but he's essentially part of that European bureaucracy anyway, because he's been absorbed into that as well, because he's dependent on them for his financial survival, frankly.
It does feel this is the main challenge, though, to make sense of what the Europeans are doing, because we are often put on an autopilot. We kind of eliminate all other options as being immoral, so we can't talk to the Russians immoral, we can't stop sending weapons is immoral. So we're on autopilot, but when you're in a war, you're losing, and we are losing. This is a disaster. But how do you assess the British role in this? Do you see it being any unique, because unique compared to the other Europeans, as a source of a new
Yeah,
post-Brexit role? Because again, you were there at the British Embassy. You're the one who had to sign
that's
off
right.
on sanctions and everything.
Yeah,
How do you read the I guess, well, the mentality or the source of the decision making here?
yeah. Well, there's a historical context to that, of course, going right back to 2014 and the Maidan and the coup, the overthrow of Yanukovych, and so on. The UK was basically, the Americans' point guard in Europe. They're really trying to kind of corral the EU back into some sort of collective decision making to, sort of double down on Russia, and that was historically our role. And I think actually Keir Starmer has tried to kind of continue that role with in a different way with Trump. He's tried to be the go-between, the European Union and Trump. But what's actually changed between 2014 and now is that actually in 2014, we were the point guard to a Democrat administration that was absolutely hostile, to Russia, and wanted to take these decisions that would essentially exacerbate the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Trump, is a leader who actually appears, and I think possibly genuinely, desirous of actually both ending the war, ending the bloodshed, but also kind of resetting relations with Russia. So that has, with the Europeans having moved over to the hardline position, so that has left the UK deeply confused about where it stands post Brexit at a time when we're rolling out the red carpet to Donald Trump because, for perfectly legitimate and understandable reasons, we want to kind of, have good trading relationships with the Americans. Uh, Intelligence, security, military kind of historical relationship remains a very important relationship, to us, and yet we're on a different side of the fence to the Americas now as it relates to Russia and Ukraine. So that leaves us in a very difficult position at a time, in any case, where we have very little leverage, in Europe, having left the Union.
Well, one of the new things which is happening, although it seems that we have the same reactions every time, were these Russian drones. Well, alleged Russian drones. I say alleged because the Russian side is claiming that this is a false flag operation by the Ukrainians. But anyways, the story is that these Russian drones, which came amidst of a massive attack, so with about 800 drones entering Ukraine, it's quite possible that something happened, that they entered Ukrainian airspace by accident. It could happen it was deliberate as well, to send a warning to the Europeans to step down. But either way, it seems to be now the reaction is, as always, that many European countries are calling for stepping up the pressure against the Russians. Some are now again saying we should revive the idea of a no-fly zone by shooting down missiles and drones over Ukrainian airspace from Poland. Now, this is all premised on I guess, the false assumption that Russia is not allowed to and will not respond by targeting those military assets in Poland. It seemed that the former Russian president Dmitry Medvedev punched a hole in this when he now came out and said that if there is an effort to have such a no-fly zone, partial even, this would mean direct war between NATO and Russia. Um, what are you making of this? Is this just the Europeans, as you said, waking up every morning at 6 a.m. and just hammering out the same stuff? Or do you think this is something they could actually do? Because there is panic in the air that the things are going wrong
Well,
really quickly in Ukraine.
there's panic in the European area, I think, more than in the Russian. Look, I mean, I think the Russians like to play mind games. I know that very well. I've got a lot of respect for them, but they are a tough adversary, as we've seen sort of in Ukraine. So don't rule out the possibility they've done this to kind of raise the heat of it, to provoke a reaction, which indeed they have. It has provoked the event. I also, frankly, don't rule out, the idea that the Ukrainians themselves would do this. I mean, I think they're crazy enough, frankly, to do anything to kind of grab attention to prolong the war. I think Zelensky would take, the opportunity. But I mean, if you look at the response from Alex Sikorsky, he this statement, which was angry but yet bland. It was so bland and toothless. If you saw it, he did this statement that's on his X account, Alex Sikorsky, one of the most divisive, weird kind of double dealings of the politicians that I kind of see as it relates to conversation about the conflict, in Ukraine. It was so bland. He said, "Well, this is an outrage, and because of this, we've convened a meeting." Oh my God, great! You've convened a meeting. I mean, that will really scare the life out of Putin. You've convened a meeting, and it was so. Well, that characterized the mentality of Europe, that we'll have a meeting and we'll all sit around and we'll say that we're outraged about this and Russia's really naughty boy and shouldn't do it again. And that characterizes the mentality, of it. And Russia knows this, and Russia will happily, in circumstances where to them, I think they see the Europeans are actively trying to block, peace in Ukraine. They will pull these strings, to provoke a reaction, and that's what's happened. So, but I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't know the details of exactly who. It could have been the Ukrainians, could have been the Russians, but I mean, the response was still the same. 6 a.m., Sonny and Cher. I got you, babe. Let's have a meeting and say it's terrible and Russia's bad and let's put more pressure. But actually, nothing really, nothing really changes.
Well, this could also be something inherited from the 90s and 2000s, because at the time the EU was looking like a very prosperous and attractive integration initiative. So most of the countries along the periphery would like to join the EU. So for this reason, and even the ones who wouldn't join still needed good trade agreements. So because of this,
Yeah.
it was argued there was a gravitational pull, and the EU got its political power from setting conditions on trade. So in the academic world, everyone refers to EU as a legislative superpower, because all they have to do is hold a meeting, wave their pen, and then the countries at the periphery would fall in line based on their speeches and announcements and documents released. So
Yeah.
it does seem that they haven't adjusted to the reality now, that they don't have this anymore. The gravitational pull is gone and their power is gone. The Russians don't have anything that Russia wants anymore. But but with the drone stories, do you see any push in Europe to ask for any investigation at all? I mean, we shouldn't take. I spoke yesterday with the Russian representative at the United Nations, Dmitry Polyansky. Again, he said that this was a false flag by the Ukrainians. Again, we shouldn't take the Russian position at face value, but after the Russiagate, the Biden laptop, the alleged bounties on U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, the scrambling of the GPS signals on von der Leyen's plane, Russia attacking its own nuclear power plants. I mean, all of this,
which was quickly ruled out to be
but should we, at least after all this, we have to recognize there's been a lot of fake news with an obvious agenda. So shouldn't we at least have some evidence, investigation? Are anyone actually pushing for investigation before we, go to war with Russia?
Well, yeah, but I mean, they're not going to go to war, and this is just another kind of blowing of hot air. Like I said, I mean, without knowing who launched the drones, I can't say. I mean, I can absolutely, see the Ukrainians, would do this, but I can also see, in some aspects at least, the Russians might, and the Russians going to deny it anyway. But I mean, nothing has really changed from what has happened. I mean, I think if you think of the balance of arguments, here, what it does, it just solidifies the European position, to continue blocking the war. But you could argue that's also in sort of, Russia's interest too, because I mean, Europe is going to run out of money before Russia does to support the war, as even the Wall Street Journal sort of announced just last week. So, I mean, I think you're talking about this kind of the project of Europe, and this not wanting evidence. I mean, as you know, I mean, we spent a few days in Georgia, sort of back in June. I was there again last week, and actually they have their local elections coming up at the start of October. and they've invited the OSCE election monitoring mission to come and visit, and they've refused. Like with 1 month, with only 1 month's notice. The OSCE said, well, that's clearly not enough time. 1 month is not enough time for us to have an election monitoring mission. So, well, why are they doing this? I mean, why are they doing this? It's so that they don't have evidence, so that they can continue to say that Georgia's this undemocratic state and they're kind of repressing opposition parties without the inconvenience of having to send an election monitoring mission there. They might say, well, actually, as they did in October of last year with the parliamentary elections, the elections were run quite well. So, I mean, that's just another. I mean, who needs evidence in a post-truth world? It's enough if you're European to know that the Russians are bad and we're good, and evidence is just a desperate inconvenience.
Well, that's the danger of this war of narratives, though, controlling the information spaces.
Yeah.
No one trusts what the media is saying anymore, and the agendas. I think, like they did with this story, which flopped very quickly, that the Russians were, jamming the signals for the plane of von der Leyen, circling for hours or something. All of this, and then it turned out, oh no, there was no evidence, and they landed in less than 10 minutes. I mean, this is
It's like Hillary Clinton arriving in the Balkans under fire. Do you remember that one?
Yeah, Clinton. Yeah. No, but it's just, but you can see why they're pumping this story so ferociously, and it's a bit concerning that it's always to escalate a conflict, and I would dismiss that they're just what they've done over the past few years, as you said, they wake up every day, but is something different happening, I guess, because we're seemingly reaching the end of the line here. This our war in Ukraine can't really continue. You said we're running out of money, but
I think as I've said very, very often over the past year, foreign policy begins and ends with domestic policy. The reason the Poles are participating in the war is because they don't want to get obliterated, and actually for them, for the Poles, it's not really in their interest for Ukraine to join the EU either, because they'd lose all of their kind of 6 billion, I think, in subsidies every year. I think, or 60 billion. The largest subsidies are any with their European countries. And the Poles don't really kind of want Ukraine to join the EU anyway. So for them, actually having the war continues is a kind of a good, gamble. We in the UK talk tough on Russia, but we don't have any troops. So, we don't want to fight Russia, but we'd sooner sanction sort of Russia instead. And Germany is the same. I mean, the reason that they're not sending Taurus missiles is because they don't really want to get involved in a war with Russia, because they don't have the domestic political support to do that anyway, at a time when AfD is on the rise. And so on. France is in political crisis, again, and, in a country that's had a massive fiscal deficit since 1954, committing to spend, 5% of GDP on defense by 2035. They don't have the money to do it. They just French do not have the money to spend 5% of their GDP on defense without some massive internal domestic political, turmoil. So, I mean, I think we are entering into a period, I think, of extreme domestic political instability in the major powers on the European continent. And by that, I mean Britain, which is going through all these kind of flag protests at the moment. I don't know if you've been following the news, on that. Keir Starmer's unassailable majority suddenly looks very assailable. I mentioned, France. Merz is, I think, got off to a fairly bad start in Germany. He doesn't really have any answers to the massive industrial policy challenges and macroeconomic challenges facing his country, i.e. the kind of the deindustrialization being driven by the war in Ukraine. They're going to pay the penalty of the ballot boxes, and we're going to end up with more nationalist governments, I think, over the next 5 to 10 years. But I hope nationalist with a small n, that actually want to have more peaceful relations with all countries on the continent, including Russia, and that may well be a good thing when it happens, in the future. But until we get to that point, we're going to have a period of incredible turmoil, economic distress, particularly with the final denouement of Ukraine, when we realize that we just don't have any money to keep keep Zelensky kind of fighting a war that benefits no one but him and his entourage. And the getting to the good point, the Blue Lagoon in 5 to 10 years from now, when the Euro globalist elites have been pushed out of office and a more moderate nationalism has arrived that wants peaceful relations with states. For then, yes, I'm afraid I see much peril in our future.
Yeah, people often use the idea of a return of nationalist as something only negative, but when when it entails pursuing national interests, and those national interests are is to end the war, start peace,
Yeah.
reindustrialize, then if that's your option and alternative is Chancellor BlackRock Mertz, who is just spewing out war and subordinating their political system to the U.S. and deindustrializing at a rapid rate, and it's you would go for the nationalist. It does make sense. It does take me to my last. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I was going to say, I mean, I wrote a piece on this, it was a month or so ago. I mean, I think, foreign policy always begins with the nation. We're meant even during, believe it or not, even during my time as a British diplomat, we're always meant to start from the position of, well, why is this foreign issue important to us as a country? How does this foreign issue help to advance our core strategic interests? How does it help us improve our security? How does it help us keep our citizens safe? And how does it help us drive economic prosperity, for our citizens, right? All foreign policy ultimately should go through those kind of 3 key lenses in terms of what, is this foreign policy, will they improve or actually kind of worsen, each of those kind of 3. So nationalism is really about just thinking about sort of, how you can benefit your country, not at the exclusion of other countries, but how you can avoid self-harm through your interactions with other countries. And in that regard, I think it's not necessarily, a bad thing.
The last thing I wanted to ask is, well, actually, what you touched on now, which is, the mood in European politics, because you are correct that the ability to confront Russia further is problematic, not only because we're running out of Ukrainians, but also within Europe. We have a lack of military and economic power to escalate, even if we would want to. But there's also this other issue which you suggested, the political capital and the political stability. Especially if you look at the large 3 ones, Britain, France, and Germany, there seems to be a pre-revolutionary mood, or a crisis of legitimacy, that they ignored perhaps the national interest for so long that it's very difficult to hold on to power without very extreme authoritarian means. But what do you see happening in Europe because this is very unique times we're living in. As I said, the economic decline, but also the lack of political legitimacy of the leadership. This is
Yeah.
very dangerous.
It is a very unique time, and one of the kind of core underlying drivers of the state we're in is the fact that we don't have a free press and free speech. Across Europe, certainly not in the UK. I think possibly more so in France, but definitely not in Britain. And you can't have real democracy if without free speech, right? I mean, democracy is about sort of having political discourse, letting people choose between sort of different options, and then having a sort of periodic, recycling of parliamentarians as facts on the ground change and governments still don't perform to the citizens' needs, right? But if you don't have a free press and free speech, then actually you end up delegitimizing democracy itself. We lecture other countries about the benefits of liberal sort of democracy without ourselves actually being democratic. So I think that is the crisis of legitimacy that we face now. The fact that we have become anti-democratic in our actions, including how they relate to other countries. So that's and so I think that's why people are starting to wake up to that. They're waking up to the fact that the media lies to them on a daily basis, that their views are seen as stupid or not sort of liberal enough, for the elites in London. And they have they're disenfranchised by the process. People feel they can't fly the English flag in the streets because the government tells them if you fly the flag of your own country, that's somehow racist. Well, people say, well, hold on a minute, this is our country's flag. So, it's a massive challenge for us right now. And I think that's actually on a positive note. I always seem to end with you on a negative note, Ben, which I apologize. But on a positive note, I think what you're doing on alternative media actually is a really important part of that change. Your show, what Alex Mercouris, and others do, Danny Davis, Andrew Napolitano, and so on. You're giving more people access to just different ideas. You're not trying to tell people how to think. You're just opening people's minds to different empirically kind of based sort of often information and so on. And I think that is part of the change too. And it's a long, long way that continue.
Well, the thought behind it was kind of simple. It's just you find these very important experts who have a lot to contribute to understanding a situation, but you notice that they're absent in the media because they reach the wrong conclusion, so they don't want to talk to them. So I guess that's my motivation, at least, to try to find to bring in who the media should have been talking to as well. But
Yeah. So Noam Chomsky's been talking about this for decades, right?
Oh yeah, we should have paid more attention, I guess.
Yeah.
Anyways, you got your hands full there in Budapest now, so thank you so much for your time.
Cheers, Glenn. Always great to talk to you.